Welcome to my two-part video of freezing and using frozen yeast. In part one, I'm going to go through the process of freezing yeast from a yeast slurry, and then in part two, I will use some of my yeast that I've frozen previously. I hope it's interesting. Basically, the steps involve creating a combination yeast slurry, water, glycerin mixture, and it's pretty straightforward. You use 50% yeast slurry and 50% water and glycerin so that you have a 15% concentration of glycerin in the whole combination of things. Anyway, follow along. I hope you get something out of it. Welcome back. Tonight I'm going to do something a little bit different, something I've never done before as far as videos go. I'm going to track how I take some of my harvested yeast and freeze it. Now what freezing does is it gives you the ability to keep your yeast a lot longer than you would normally. If you keep your yeast frozen and it stays frozen, it can last for years. I've read even as many as 10 years. I don't know if that's the case. I haven't used any yeast that old, so I'm just going to take that with a grain of salt. But anyway, it will last definitely a lot longer than if you keep yeast in the refrigerator. Now, when you buy yeast from someplace like Yeast or White Labs, usually it has a born-on date or an expiration date. Usually that's about 6 months. At least that's been my experience when I've seen it. Anywhere from 4 to 6 months. Anyhow, so when I've harvested yeast in the past, and you may have seen my earlier video of that, I take it and I'll put it in a little plastic pop bottle. You could put it in a ball jar or mason jar. But I put it in the refrigerator, keep it cold, and I've used yeast as old as 6 or 7 months in the refrigerator. You have to make a good starter because you have lost a lot of yeast cells in that 6-month period. But if you build up a yeast starter and start slow, you can use that yeast that's half a year old. Frozen yeast, from what I understand, can be used as much as 10 years past. I don't know. Now, when you do freeze yeast, you've got to make sure that you take into account the fact that most modern freezers have a defrost cycle. And when the freezer defrosts, it raises the temperature in the freezer just enough above freezing so that the frost melts, and then it cools it back down. These temperature fluctuations aren't good for frozen yeast. It needs to stay at a relatively constant temperature. Now, there are different ways of doing this. The most common way is to take your yeast bank, stick it in a cooler inside your freezer, and maybe put a couple ice packs in that cooler so that as the freezer raises and lowers its temperature, the stuff inside that cooler is not going to raise and lower the temperature that much, because for part of the reason it's in a cooler, which insulates it, and then that ice pack will help keep the temperature more constant. Anyway, that's what I'm planning on doing. Let me show you a little bit what I have here. I've got some glycerin. I got this at CVS in their cosmetic area. I've got some other glycerin over here that I got at Baker's, the local Kroger type store, I think. And this, well, actually I got this at a Hobby Lobby. This was in their cake decorating area. They use the glycerin in frosting to do different things. I've also got some water over here that I've boiled to sanitize it. It's in an ice bucket. What I'm going to do is mix some water with the glycerin in my flask here, and then I'm going to boil it again and cool it back down just to sanitize the glycerin. When you're harvesting yeast, sanitation is key. You don't want anything dirty around. You don't want anything that could possibly have organisms that could contaminate your yeast. You have to take your cleaning to the next level above what you do on the cold side of your brewing. I do have some uh, centrifuge containers here I got off of Amazon. Now these aren't the kind that will go into a autoclave. They're plastic, but they are. You can sanitize them. I've got a little bucket here of Star San. These have actually been soaking in a big bucket of Star San for quite some time. Actually, a couple days. I threw them in there ago. And got a fork here in the sanitizer. I'm going to use that to stir everything around. The yeast I'm going to freeze. I got 2 of them here. I got a White Labs WPL 004 Irish Ale yeast. And then over here I've got some Rogue Pac-Man yeast. Now this is yeast that I harvested myself from a bottle of Rogue Santa Stout, I believe, that I purchased last year. And I've actually got it, and I've used it 3 times. This is my 3rd generation of the yeast, so I want to freeze it before it could possibly mutate. It's worked pretty good up to now. When I make my yeast slurry that's going to go in the freezer, what I will do is I'll put 1/3 yeast and 2/3 a mixture of water and the glycerin. So this is a 50 milliliter flask. I'll probably fill it up to a little over 45 milliliters, which is right here, maybe, I don't know, 3/8 of an inch below the cap. It's 50 milliliters all the way up to the line. I may fill it up there. We'll see how it goes. But again, it'll be probably 20 milliliters of yeast slurry and 30 milliliters of water and glycerin. Now, you use water and glycerin in combination because the glycerin will surround the yeast cells, and when things freeze, it's a lot more gentle. It's like a cushion, and the yeast cells aren't going to explode from freezing. If you just put the yeast in water or just froze it in a bottle like this, the water will crystallize and the crystals are going to break the yeast. The glycerin stops that from happening. You can search online. There's a bunch of instructions on how to do this, and that's how I learned. But it's really pretty straightforward. You just need to make sure that your yeast water combination ends up to where you have no more than 15% glycerin in the solution, and the rest can be the yeast and water. The 15% glycerin figure is one that's published in all the articles. They say that more glycerin is detrimental to the yeast, and less glycerin doesn't protect it enough. So 15% of the solution is what you're shooting for. Now what I will do here, I'm going to make 100 milliliters of water and glycerin in my cup here, and it'll be 70 milliliters of water, 30 milliliters of glycerin. So I'll have the 30% solution there. Now then what I will do is I'll make this 25 milliliters of water and then 25 milliliters of yeast slurry, and that'll end up giving me a 15% yeast solution in my flask. Anyway, follow along, and I hope you learned something. And when I'm done, leave me some comments if you like this idea, and try it out. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is take some of my water here that I boiled and put it in here. Excuse me for a second. Okay, I had to get my glasses. Otherwise I'm not going to be able to see what I'm doing here. Okay, my little measuring cup here is 120 milliliters. So what I'm going to do first thing is put 30 milliliters of glycerin in here. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and put this in the microwave and heat it up. My microwave's back here. Okay, I'll come back in a second when that's done. I put it in for 60 seconds. Well, that kind of sucked. Okay, well, that kind of sucked. Put my glycerin-filled measuring cup in the microwave, pulled it out, immediately set it on the counter, and the bottom popped off of it. Spilled a little bit of glycerin all over the place. Just finished wiping it down. A couple of drops here, but so I guess I'm going to have to come up with another method here. Maybe it's not a good idea to put glycerin in all by itself. It must have gotten way too hot for this cup. So don't do that. Those of you looking for continuity errors, you notice this beer was almost empty last time you saw me. Okay, so plan B. I'm going to measure 30 milliliters of glycerin into one of my vials here. And okay, put my glasses on. Okay. Alright, there's 30 milliliters. And I'm going to go ahead and pour that into this measuring cup here. Now this time, I'm going to go ahead and put some water in here so it's not all glycerin. And I'm going to add enough water to get this up to 100 milliliters. Okay. And I'm going to stir that around a little. And 100 milliliters. I am going to put this in the microwave. This time, maybe not for so long. I think I'll do it for maybe just 30 seconds. I've microwaved the glycerin and water combination in my measuring cup. Let it cool a little bit. I got it sitting in an ice bath back here, cooling. So now I'm going to go ahead and get started with the other parts of the process, and we'll add that as we need it. Okay. I'm going to line up a couple bottles here. Okay. Now, as I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it 50% yeast and 50% of the water combination there. I'm going to pour off some of the liquid that's separated from the yeast. This yeast has been in my refrigerator for over a month, maybe a month and a half. So I'm going to pour this off. Okay, I poured off just enough to where I've just got a little bit left on the bottom there. And actually that's too much. Okay, now what I'm going to do is build a yeast slurry out of this just by shaking it up. And get all that yeast off the bottom. Okay. And I'm going to pour it into the vials here. I said I'm going to go 50-50, so I'm going to look at the measurements on here. I want to get close to 50 milliliters. If I don't get quite that much, not a big deal. I'm not sure exactly how much this yeast slurry is going to add up to. Okay. Believe it or not, that's going to be just about right. You can't really see. I'll bring it over. I'm going to wait a minute before I do anything else. But right there, it's right at about the 30 milliliter mark. Liquid is right about here at 22 and a half milliliters. And there's enough bubbles there, so when those bubbles subside, I might just be right at 25. Perfect. This second one here is just a hair over 25, and the other one's just a hair under. So I'm just going to move some over so that they're about even. Alright, now let's see how my yeast slurry is here. I want to make sure that this is nice and cool, because I don't want to kill any yeast. Yeah, I'm just going to give it another minute or so. We'll come back. Alright, my water is down to an acceptable level, and I'm just going to pour it in. Since I had 25 milliliters, I'm going to pour it all the way up to the top where 50 milliliters should be. Leave just a little bit of head space. Alright, there you go. Filled up almost to the top. Now put the cap on. Nice and tight. A little bit of head space there. Shake it up just a bit. Don't want to shake it too much because I really don't want air bubbles in there, but I do want to make sure that the water and glycerin is mixed in nicely. And 2 vials ready for freezing. So now I'll move on to my next batch. Now I will label those before I put them away. I'm going to let them settle, and I'll shake them 1 or 2 more times before I put them in the freezer. Okay, the next one I'm going to do is going to be this Pac-Man yeast. And what I'm doing is I'm looking. These are not nearly as full of bottles as the other one, so I want to make sure I have enough here. Grab some of the fuller bottles. Yeah, okay. Okay, these are the 3 fullest ones. I'm going to use the tall one. And yeah, this one's got a little more trub in it than yeast. Okay, we'll see how that goes. Put this out of the way. Can do the same thing. I'm going to pour out the liquid here. Let's see what I got. Well, looking at these, there's not nearly as much of the yeast in the bottom of these. Because there's no way there's going to be 50 milliliters of yeast slurry under here. I've had a heck of a time getting it off of the bottom. Well, anything that's stuck to the bottom is probably a little bit of trouble. Alright, well, let's see what we got here. Probably going to end up adding more. Another bottle. Yeah, there's not nearly enough there. This rate, I'm going to be lucky to get one. Markings here. See what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop this one at about 20. Yeah, looks like I'm going to need another bottle. So, let's go for one of the shorter ones. This one looks like it's got a bunch in it, comparatively. Okay, here's one. That's not that much. Now, it's a good way to fill up your yeast bank. So when you start running low on different types of yeast, you always got some available. Some people take stuff right off of their starter and don't even bother pitching it. They just use their starter yeast. Okay, looks like I'll probably end up with enough here. At least close enough to where I'm not going to worry too much about it. Yep, about 25 milliliters in both of them. So, okay. 25, and pour this up to the top again. Just like I did with the last one, I'm going to pour it up. Pour it just a little shy. We need to make up some more glycerin water here. Okay, well, I'm going to top these off with a little more glycerin water. I'll have to make some more up. But that's how you freeze yeast. Well, I'm all done. These are the vials I put together. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 of them. I had 4 different kinds of yeast that I froze, or I'm freezing. I got a White Labs Irish Ale, Rogue Pac-Man, Danstar Munich Classic, and White Labs American Hefeweizen. So 4 different yeast varieties. I did do an extra one of the Hefeweizen. I'm going to use that as a sample test, and I'm going to freeze this for a few weeks and then come back and do a starter from it and see how it turns out. Over here I got my cooler bag that I put my yeast in. Let's see if I can tilt it up. I got a bunch of other little frozen bottles in there already. And I've got everything from some Safe Lager 3470 to some White Labs WPL 001, American ale yeast, I believe, to some Safe Ale SO4. Now, one thing I did do that some people don't really recommend, or at least they say it's not worth the hassle, is I have harvested and frozen some of what is typically dry yeast. The Danstar Munich Classic yeast that I did today, that's a dry yeast. A lot of people say don't waste your time. You can buy a packet of dry yeast for, I don't know, $6, $7, depending on which one you're getting. And yeah, I suppose that is true. It is kind of a hassle, kind of a waste of time. Dry yeast you just put in, you don't have to make a starter. But I'm still being frugal. I'll still see what happens. I make my starters from second runnings, typically from stronger batches, and I'll make second runnings and I'll have like 3 or 4 quarts of wort that's at a 1040, or maybe a little less than 1040, maybe a 1020, and then I'll boil it down so that it raises it up to 1040, and then I can it. And I always have some canned wort around. Anyhow, I say try it. What the hell? If you got dry yeast, harvest it, freeze it, use it again. I've used SO4 yeast numerous times from harvested yeast, and it works great every time. So anyway, there you go. Hope you learned a little bit of something. Give me some comments if you have any, and try it out. See how it works for you. Anyway, take care. Cheers.